there. We've got a lot to do today, so buckle in.
No! Oh, I love it!
Do you not have virtue but want it? Well, Confucianism is for you.
All right, so as soon as you've finished reading and grouping the documents and writing your thesis statement, we're going to take some notes on page 37 as we move into communism in Latin America. So first, looking at Cuba in 1953, that was one of the first successful communist revolutions in Latin America, led by Fidel Castro against the incumbent Batista. One of my students 2 years ago was actually the great-great-granddaughter of Batista, who faced a lot of opposition from the working class of Cuba, which Castro was able to unite to institute a communist regime. Initially, Castro was very popular in Cuba, but as you'll see later in class today, that changed over time. Communism in Nicaragua came with the success of the Sandinistas. Just like the Solidarity movement in Hungary, this was sort of a political party, a political movement to destroy the present system of capitalist exploitation and oppression. So basically, this was a communist party, which was first successful in 1979. And then again in 2006, when current president Daniel Ortega was elected as a Sandinista candidate. In Venezuela, we're actually going to listen to an excerpt from the podcast called The Daily. This excerpt details Hugo Chávez's rise to power in the 1990s.
Well, when you think about Venezuela, the most important thing to keep in mind, both politically and economically and to a certain degree socially, is the oil. Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves in the world, larger than Saudi Arabia. Mm-hmm. And so it's the potential beneficiary of this extraordinary wealth. And yet, even under the nominal democracy at the time that Leo was growing up, there was enormous stratification of income. And so this underclass was becoming increasingly frustrated by the distribution of wealth to a very small group of the upper class and the abject poverty throughout so much of the country. Remember, these were really the conditions that led to the popularity in the late 1990s of Hugo Chávez, who was promising in a very forceful way to redistribute this income from the oil and give more of it to the people. So when Chávez becomes president in the late 1990s, at the same time the price of oil is also skyrocketing. And he is showered with revenue from the state oil company, which he does distribute. He does make good on a lot of these promises. Unemployment plunges, income inequality in Venezuela becomes one of the lowest levels in the Western Hemisphere, and the poor love him for it. But as the price of oil goes down over the second half of his presidency, you start to see economic trouble creep in. The country was also entering real shortages of food and medicine. And yet at the same time, Chávez is obliterating democratic institutions, basically one by one. He's consolidating power, he's stacking the courts, he's empowering and emboldening these paramilitary collectivo groups who will take action against anyone who appears to threaten his grip on power. So, for example, when organized protests take to the streets, you can expect the paramilitary collectivos to arrive and beat up on the protesters. And as Leopoldo watches this, he decides that he's going to challenge Chávez for power.
So for the rest of class today, you're going to be looking at conflicts over communism in Latin America. And some very important context to keep in mind as you move through these case studies is that the Monroe Doctrine about a century prior and the Roosevelt Corollary at the beginning of the 20th century established the United States as a police power in Latin America, which meant wherever we see communist movements gaining momentum throughout Central and South America, the United States almost always gets involved. So the first case study you're going to be looking at is the relationship between the United States and Cuba. Here on the top of page 40, you'll just sort of brain dump everything you remember from last year. about the relationship between the United States and Cuba, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Bay of Pigs invasion, etc., etc. Many of you may remember from last year that there were assassination attempts on Fidel Castro, but Castro, understanding his role in the expansion of communism around the globe, is very careful as to how he presents his views toward the United States. So 2 people in your group are going to take a look at the 1959 interview in this document called Corroborating Castro's Views on the U.S. 2 will look at the interview, and 2 will take a look at the 1961 speech to complete the table at the bottom of page 40. Next, we're going to take a look at Cuba's involvement in Angola. In 1974, well, through the 1970s actually, Cuba was involved in supporting a communist group vying for power in the newly independent Angola. That was the former colony of the Portuguese. And they're met with opposition, not just from the United States, as you would expect during the Cold War, but also from South Africa. The MLPA was predominantly Black Africans, and the white regime in South Africa feared that the MLPA's success would establish a precedent of Black rule of African nations. So you're going to use the documents here in the document called Cuba and Angola to read a little overview of our Operation Carlota. That was what the Cubans called their involvement in Angola, their support for this communist group. And then you're going to take a look here at 20 different perspectives on Cuba's involvement. So after you have read and answered all the questions on page 41 about all these different perspectives on Cuba's involvement in Angola, you'll go through the 20 sources again and plot them on a matrix. So I just started going through a few here. And basically the sources that agree with each other go in the middle, and those that are divergent go toward the outside. So I noticed when I was looking through the South African documents, a lot of them are pretty straightforward. Like, we don't want Black rule in Africa because that will challenge the legitimacy of the white minority rule we have in South Africa, and they're pretty clear about that in a lot of the messaging. Same thing with Angola. They want independence, and they're being very upfront about that. Cuba is actually a little all over the place, I've noticed, in terms of what they're claiming their involvement in Angola is and the purpose of it, and the United States is certainly the most divergent from agreeing with the other sources in terms of what's going on. So go through and plot them on this matrix right over the answers that you have written. And then, if you're interested, we noticed after the election of the first Black president in South Africa, that's Nelson Mandela. We'll talk more about him after the break. He expressed gratitude. Last thing you have here for the assignment is to watch this quick clip. It's an exchange between Nelson Mandela and Fidel Castro. Mandela was the first Black president of South Africa. We'll learn more about him after the break. But he expresses a lot of appreciation for Fidel Castro's involvement in helping establish Black rule over a Black African nation, especially during a time when there was a lot of violence surrounding the shift in power from the colonizers to the native peoples of Africa. So if you watch, it's really quite surprising. It's two people you would not expect to have as much respect for each other as they do.
So I asked my friend what she thought you should ask your parents, and she said that you should ask them about their first concert or the best concert that they went to. I was pretty adamant that I didn't want to put you in that situation, but she seemed to think it was a good idea. So, question for today, ask your parents about their favorite concert. I'm sorry to all parties involved.